There are stories that echo through the corridors of time, tales whispered in the dark corners of our minds, where light barely touches and shadows reign supreme. These are not mere fairy tales. They are the haunting, raw, and profoundly emotional threads that make up the very fabric of our collective consciousness. The Brothers Grimm, their names etched into the history of folklore, gave us not just stories, but windows into worlds where innocence is tested, courage is forged in darkness, and even the purest hearts must grapple with the complexities of evil. Their words, chilling and beautiful, cast a spell that lingers, pulling us deeper into their twisted yet enchanting worlds. Imagine a world where the snow falls thick and heavy, turning everything into an icy, unforgiving wasteland. In this frozen landscape, a queen gazes at the snow outside her window, pricking her finger, letting 3 drops of blood fall onto the white expanse. It is here that the seeds of one of the most famous tales are planted. A child, as pure as the snow, as red as the blood, and as black as the ebony frame surrounding the window. An impossible wish, born from longing, but also, unknowingly, from something darker. This is the heart of the Brothers Grimm's genius, weaving the most innocent desires with the most sinister outcomes. But these are not stories of simple good versus evil. They are stories of struggle, of deep internal conflict, where characters, often children, are caught between the forces of nature, fate, and their own fears. In the quiet, forgotten forests of their tales, the line between dream and nightmare is razor thin. Snow White, with her purity and innocence, finds herself at odds with a mother figure whose vanity and envy shape her every action. The tension, thick and suffocating, drives the narrative forward. With each step Snow White takes, each moment of danger that arises, drawing us deeper into her world of hidden threats and forbidden desires. These stories, while set in a time long past, speak to something more profound, the human condition. They are not just about fairy tale endings, but about the raw, unsettling realities of life, of betrayal, sacrifice, and redemption. The Grimm brothers, with their meticulous collection of folklore, captured these dark emotions, preserving them for generations to come. Their tales may have been originally told around campfires, but they transcend their origins. They are timeless echoes of what it means to be human, full of fear, hope, and the constant battle between light and dark. As you listen to these tales tonight, picture yourself walking through that dark forest, each rustle in the trees sending a chill down your spine. Feel the weight of the silence that envelops you, the uncertainty of every step. The wind whispers secrets you can't quite understand, and the trees seem to watch, waiting for you to cross the threshold into the unknown. This is the world the Grimms created, a world where the boundaries between the seen and unseen blur, where every twist and turn holds the potential for both wonder and terror. You may find yourself drawn to these characters, not just because of their struggles with external forces, but because of their inner turmoil. They are flawed, complex beings, driven by desires both noble and corrupt. And isn't that the essence of what makes these stories so captivating? We see ourselves in them, our own battles reflected in the dark mirror the Grimms hold up to us. The Grimms didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths of life. They painted a world where good is not always rewarded, where evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. and where the heart of the story is often the struggle to survive, to outwit, and to prevail, no matter the cost. As you delve into tonight's stories, let the weight of their emotions settle over you. Let the chilling beauty of the narrative unfold in your mind. Let the characters' fears, hopes, and desires pull you into their world. The Brothers Grimm's legacy is not just in the stories they told, but in the emotional resonance they left behind. Their tales are not just tales. They are invitations to step into a world where the line between the living and the dead is as thin as the moon's silver light, where every shadow holds a secret, and where every story leaves an echo that resonates long after it has ended. In this dark, enchanting world, the Grimm brothers did more than preserve the folklore of their time. They captured the very soul of storytelling, weaving a tapestry of darkness and light that continues to haunt and inspire. So, as you listen to the whispers of the past tonight, allow yourself to be transported. Let the magic and mystery of the Brothers Grimm take root in your heart, because in their stories, there is something for all of us, a reflection of our deepest fears, our most secret hopes, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find light, even in the darkest of places. The Grimm brothers' legacy, a desire to preserve dark folklore in the early 19th century, as the winds of political and social change swept through Europe. A small town in Germany became the birthplace of two men whose passion would shape the future of storytelling. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were born into a world on the brink of transformation. The chaos of war, the decline of old kingdoms, and the rise of new ideas threatened to erase much of the culture and tradition that had sustained generations. For many, these changes were a source of anxiety and fear. But for the Grimm brothers, this period of upheaval became the backdrop of a personal mission, a mission rooted in their deep emotional connection to the folklore that had been passed down orally for centuries. Growing up in a time when the very fabric of society was shifting, Jacob and Wilhelm felt an innate responsibility to preserve the stories of their homeland. These tales were not simply myths or fables to them. They were a living history, a reflection of the people's hopes, fears, and values. They were the heartbeat of a vanishing world. The Grimms saw the tales as more than entertainment. They believed that folklore was a vital part of the cultural identity of the German people, and they feared that, with the rise of modernity and the spread of written language, these stories would fade away into obscurity, replaced by the intellectual ideals of the day. But the desire to preserve these stories came with its own emotional weight. The Grimms were not detached observers of this cultural decline. Their connection to the tales was personal, deeply personal. These stories had been shared with them by their family, their neighbors, and the common people who lived in the small, rural villages they visited. The Grimms themselves were the children of an oral tradition, and the world they loved was slipping through their fingers. This sense of loss and longing drove them to action. They set out across Germany, collecting the stories that had once been told by firelight in homes and taverns, by travelers and wanderers along dusty roads. They understood that these tales held more than just entertainment value. They were vessels of cultural memory, windows into the past that held a mirror up to the human condition. The Grimms wanted to save the raw, unfiltered beauty of these stories before they were lost forever. Yet, their journey was not without its challenges. When the Grimms first published Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales, in 1812, their collection of over 200 folk tales was met with a mixed reception. On one hand, the tales were celebrated for preserving an important aspect of German heritage. On the other hand, the darker, more macabre elements of the stories were met with resistance. Critics, many of whom were from the educated elite, dismissed the stories as too primitive, too dark, and in some cases, downright inappropriate for children. The grim nature of the stories, filled with death, betrayal, and unspeakable horrors, shocked many. To these critics, the Grimm's tales seemed like a relic of a bygone, uncivilized age, more suited to the shadows of the past than to the enlightened present. The idea that these stories could be read aloud to children was seen as almost barbaric. But for Jacob and Wilhelm, this response was both disheartening and enlightening. They knew that their work was controversial, but they also understood the power of these stories. Beneath the surface of each tale lay a universal truth, a reflection of human nature, complete with its complexities, its darkness, and its beauty. The Grimms refused to sanitize the stories. They believed that by preserving the raw emotion of the tales, their violence, their sorrow, and their moral ambiguity, they were staying true to their original form. This was not about creating a world of happy endings or sugar-coated morality. This was about exploring the depths of human experience, about understanding the shadows as much as the light. Despite the criticism, the tales began to spread beyond the borders of Germany. As the Grimm's work gained traction, more and more people, especially in other parts of Europe, began to recognize the value of these stories. Over time, the Grimm's work transcended the boundaries of a single culture. The universal themes of good versus evil, of the struggle for survival in an unforgiving world, and the exploration of the human soul's darker corners, found resonance in cultures far beyond Germany's borders. The Grimms had succeeded in capturing something that went beyond folklore. It was a mirror to the human spirit. Their tales eventually reached the United States, where they became a cornerstone of Western folklore. But even then, the Grimms faced criticism. Some decried the violence and harshness of the tales, while others praised the brothers for giving voice to a collective history that might otherwise have been lost. The contrast between the grim, sometimes violent nature of the stories and the more sanitized versions we see today in popular culture, especially in films like those produced by Disney, speaks to the enduring tension between the rawness of the original tales and the more palatable versions we have come to expect. Yet, despite all the controversy, the legacy of the Grimms lives on. The tales they collected continue to captivate audiences around the world, generations later. And while the stories have been reinterpreted, softened, and adapted in countless ways, their essence remains unchanged. The Grimms sought to preserve the darkest corners of folklore, not because they were morbid or macabre, but because they understood that darkness is as much a part of the human experience as light. The tales, though filled with horrors, also carried the seeds of hope. Hope that through struggle and suffering, we can find meaning, strength, and sometimes redemption. In the end, the Grimm's legacy is one of emotional richness and haunting intrigue. They left behind not just stories, but a testament to the power of folklore to reflect the deepest parts of the human soul. As we listen to their tales today, we are not simply hearing echoes of the past. We are hearing whispers from the shadows, stories that will forever resonate with us, hauntingly, beautifully, and always with an underlying truth that speaks to our very nature. dark and light, the paradox of fairy tales. Fairy tales, particularly those captured by the Grimm brothers, are not simply stories. They are a mirror to the complexities of human existence, reflecting both the brilliance of light and the shadows that cling to our souls. One of the most striking features of these tales is the way they intertwine the universal themes of good versus evil, how the battle between light and dark is portrayed in all its brutal yet fascinating forms. These stories often serve as a lens through which we can understand our deepest fears and desires, while offering moments of hope and triumph, no matter how fleeting. At their core, many of the Grimm's folk tales are a dramatic exploration of the forces of good and evil. The battle between these forces is never simplistic. It's layered and nuanced. In stories like Snow White, Hansel and Gretel, or The Juniper Tree, the antagonists are often cruel, monstrous figures that represent the darkest aspects of humanity: greed, jealousy, and malice. The wicked stepmother in Snow White, driven by envy, seeks to destroy a child whose beauty threatens her own sense of self-worth. In Hansel and Gretel, the cannibalistic witch is a manifestation of hunger and depravity, using the guise of kindness to lure innocent children into her home. These villains are not just evil for the sake of being evil. They are products of the darker side of human nature, driven by their own insecurities and vices. However, the stories are not merely about the defeat of evil. They also weave in moments of light, of redemption, and of hope. The protagonists, often innocent children like Snow White, or humble figures such as Cinderella, embody goodness, purity, and resilience. They endure suffering, loss, and betrayal, yet they persist. Their triumphs, however small, carry a sense of triumph over the forces that seek to tear them apart. The Grimm's tales are filled with moments where good ultimately prevails, yet it is never without a cost. This balance between the dark and the light fuels the emotional depth of the stories. But what makes these fairy tales truly compelling is the tension between their enchanting, light-hearted moments and the deeply disturbing dark elements that lurk just beneath the surface. Fairy tales, with their magical forests, talking animals, and benevolent helpers, often seem whimsical on the surface. Yet beneath this enchantment lies a pervasive sense of danger, mystery, and menace. The woods are not just a place of adventure. They are dark, unpredictable, and sometimes deadly. The magic that seems so inviting in the beginning often takes on a more sinister tone as the story unfolds. In Little Red Cap, the seemingly harmless walk through the woods quickly becomes a journey into the unknown, where the girl encounters a wolf whose predatory nature is only revealed too late. These moments of horror are not mere accidents. They are integral to the story's atmosphere. The enchantment is not solely a tool for comfort. It also exists to draw the reader into a world of uncertainty, of suspense, and most importantly, of introspection. It is this interplay between light and dark, the soft glow of fantasy and the shadows of reality, that makes these tales so haunting. The Grimm brothers understood this paradox intuitively. They knew that fairy tales are most powerful when they tap into the darker recesses of the human experience. In these stories, evil is not always punished with a neat resolution. Often, evil is cunning and ever-present, lurking just beyond the horizon. It is not easily vanquished, and sometimes it is not vanquished at all. This leaves a lingering sense of unease as if the world of the tale, though seemingly resolved, is never entirely safe. The eerie elements of these stories, a blood-red apple in Snow White, a pair of iron shoes that force the wicked queen to dance to her death, a millstone that crushes the villain in The Juniper Tree, serve as potent metaphors for the darker sides of the human psyche. These are not just symbols of punishment. They are symbols of the unrelenting consequences of actions. These tales force the reader to confront the brutal reality that there are repercussions for evil deeds, and that sometimes the darkness can reach us when we least expect it. Yet, within this darkness, there is a strange beauty. The eerie, the unsettling, the strange. These elements fuel our curiosity and make us reflect on the nature of human existence itself. The fear that these tales provoke is not one of mindless terror, but one that prompts introspection, urging us to consider the world not just in terms of good and evil, but in shades of gray. It is this very duality, the delicate balance between light and dark, that makes the Grimm's tales so emotionally rich. We are drawn to these stories not just for their magic or whimsy, but for the way they make us feel the full spectrum of emotion. We are horrified by the evil characters, yet we find ourselves rooting for the protagonists, even as they suffer and struggle against forces beyond their control. In this way, these stories are reflections of our own lives, where we too experience moments of joy and pain, love and loss, triumph and tragedy. The tension between good and evil in these folk tales is not resolved by simple, clean endings. The endings are often ambiguous, unsettling, and open to interpretation. This, too, is part of their power. They leave us with lingering questions. Questions about the nature of evil, the meaning of suffering, and the ultimate cost of redemption. They invite us to ponder not just the fate of the characters within the tale, but our own fate. And it is through this reflection that these tales remain timeless. In the end, it is this paradox, the delicate dance between the enchanting and the disturbing, that makes the Grimm brothers' fairy tales so captivating. They are stories that draw us in with their light, only to pull us into the shadows. They enchant us, but in doing so, they also reveal the darker, more complex truths of the world. And it is this balance, this haunting interplay between light and dark, that continues to captivate and intrigue us, generation after generation. The Juniper Tree, a mother's sacrifice and a son's resurrection. Beneath the shadowed branches of a mighty juniper tree, a tale unfolds, one steeped in deep sorrow, haunting imagery, and a sense of longing that resonates long after the story is told. The Juniper Tree, a chilling yet beautiful tale from the Brothers Grimm, weaves together the themes of love, death, and rebirth in a way that sears into the soul. It is a story of a mother's desperate yearning for a child, a tragedy that unfolds in the cold silence of death, and the miraculous return of life in a form that both comforts and unsettles. The tale begins with a woman who, like many before her, wishes for something she cannot have, a child. She prays, she hopes, and she waits. Her desire is so deep, so desperate, that it becomes a part of her very being. Her longing for a child is not a passing wish. It is the very heartbeat of her existence. She prays beneath the juniper tree, a symbol of life and death intertwined, wishing for a son as red as blood and as white as snow. Her desire is met, but the joy is fleeting. Her son is born as promised, but her own life is not spared. In the cruel twist of fate, her joy becomes her undoing. The mother, overwhelmed with happiness at the birth of her child, dies shortly after, her life extinguished just as the life of her son begins. The emotional weight of the mother's death hangs heavily over the tale. She is a woman who was willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to bring new life into the world. Her wish is granted, but at a heartbreaking cost. She is taken from the world just as she experiences the joy she has so longed for. Her passing marks the beginning of her son's tragic journey, one that will see him orphaned and unloved by the very woman who birthed him. A cruel irony that sets the stage for the darker elements of the story. As time passes, the child's life is governed by the cruelty of a stepmother, whose hatred and jealousy cast a shadow over his existence. She sees in the boy a threat, a rival for the love and attention of his father, and her heart turns cold with malice. She abuses him, pushing him from one corner to the other, slapping him, forcing him into a life of fear and anxiety. The boy, orphaned by his mother's death, and now abused by his stepmother, is left with no solace, no peace. It is a life marked by neglect, by loneliness, and by the slow, painful unraveling of his spirit. Yet, in the midst of this cruelty, there is a strange twist of fate. The boy's tragic end comes not at the hands of a monster or a predator, but through a brutal and unspeakable act of his stepmother's malice. In an eerie moment, she offers him an apple that will be his last. It is a moment of false kindness, a cruel invitation that hides the true evil lurking beneath her surface. The boy, trusting in the gesture, takes the apple and is slain. The mother's deep, painful yearning for her son is shattered in a moment of horror, a moment in which the line between love and death becomes impossibly blurred. The haunting imagery of the boy's death is only the beginning of this dark journey. His stepmother, in an attempt to conceal her crime, cuts his body into pieces, cooking him into a stew, a grotesque act that marks the depth of her evil. His bones are gathered by his sister, and in the dead of night they are buried beneath the juniper tree, as though the earth itself might offer some solace, some connection to the life that was stolen too soon. But the juniper tree, in its quiet majesty, is not merely a symbol of nature. It is a vessel of transformation, of life and death intertwined. From its branches, the boy's spirit is resurrected in a form that is both beautiful and unsettling. The resurrection is not a gentle return to life. It is a dramatic, almost otherworldly transformation. The juniper tree, shaken by the boy's return, bursts into life. A mist rises, and in the heart of the mist, a magnificent bird emerges, singing a haunting song of his death and rebirth. This bird, with its vibrant feathers and golden eyes, is the boy, reborn in a new form, his voice a message of sorrow, of vengeance, and of the deep injustice that has been done to him. The bird's song, though filled with pain, is also filled with a strange, transcendent beauty. It is as if the very soul of the boy has been set free, his story told through the haunting notes that float in the air, forever a part of the juniper tree, forever a part of the earth. His resurrection, though beautiful in its own way, is not without its emotional weight. It is the return of a life that should never have been taken, a reclamation of something lost in the harsh, cruel world. The boy's resurrection does not simply restore life to a child who was cruelly murdered. It serves as a symbol of the eternal struggle between good and evil, between innocence and malice, and the cyclical nature of life and death. His return is not just a miracle. It is a reckoning. It is a chance for justice to be served, for the wrongs of the past to be righted. The bird, in its golden splendor, flies to the homes of the wicked and the good alike, dispensing justice in a way that is as poetic as it is horrifying. The tale of the Juniper Tree is one that resonates deeply, not just because of its eerie imagery, but because of the profound emotional depth it explores. It is a story of love and sacrifice, of death and resurrection. The mother's sacrifice for her child, the boy's tragic fate, and his eventual rebirth carry with them a weight of sorrow, but also of hope in a world that often seems filled with cruelty and darkness. The story of the Juniper Tree offers a glimmer of light, a reminder that even in the most painful of losses, there can be a rebirth, a chance for justice, and a return to the love that was lost. The tale leaves a haunting echo in the heart, a reminder that the forces of good and evil are never as clear-cut as they may seem, and that in the end, love, no matter how fleeting, will always find a way to return. Little Snow White, a tale of vanity and parental love. The story of a little Snow White unfurls as a timeless tale of envy, innocence, and betrayal, an intricate dance between light and darkness, where purity is both a gift and a curse. At its core, Snow White's tale is more than just a fairy tale. It is an exploration of the complexities of human nature, particularly through the lens of vanity, love, and the destructive power of jealousy. The contrast between Snow White's unwavering purity and the Queen's insatiable envy forms the emotional heart of this dark narrative. Snow White's innocence is immediately evident in the opening moments of the story. Born as white as snow, red as blood, and black as ebony, she is a vision of perfect beauty, symbolizing purity in its most untainted form. But her beauty, rather than being a blessing, becomes a curse, one that draws the ire of her stepmother, the Queen, whose vanity knows no bounds. The Queen's beauty is her sole identity, her source of power, and the very essence of her existence. The magic mirror, which she consults daily, has always reassured her that she is the fairest in the land, filling her with a sense of superiority. However, the moment Snow White's beauty surpasses her own, the Queen's peace is shattered, and an all-consuming envy takes root in her heart. The Queen's envy does not arise from a place of mere superficiality. It is a deep, existential fear. Her power, her position, and her sense of self-worth are all tied to her outward appearance, making Snow White's beauty not just a threat to her vanity, but to her very identity. The Queen's jealousy distorts her perception of Snow White, transforming the innocent child into a symbol of everything she fears: the passing of time, the fading of her own beauty, and the loss of her dominance over those around her. Her desire to remain the most beautiful in the land becomes an obsession that drives her to commit unimaginable acts of cruelty. The Queen's response to this perceived threat is calculated and sinister. She orders Snow White's death, sending the Huntsmen deep into the woods with the child. Yet, there is a strange vulnerability in this moment of cruelty. For the first time, we see the Queen's deep insecurity, her terror of being surpassed, of becoming irrelevant. She is not just a villainous stepmother. She is a woman consumed by the fear of losing her sense of self. The Huntsman's mercy, sparing Snow White's life, momentarily interrupts the Queen's destructive path, but the seeds of malice have already been sown. Snow White, however, is not an innocent damsel waiting to be rescued. She is a symbol of resilience in the face of cruelty. Her journey through the woods is one of survival, not just physically, but emotionally. Alone in the forest, she is forced to navigate a world that has betrayed her, but she does so with a purity and strength that contrasts sharply with the Queen's malice. Snow White's innocence is her greatest strength. It is a quiet resilience that refuses to be diminished by the hatred of those around her. It is as though her very being, her purity, has an indestructible quality, a light that cannot be extinguished, no matter how dark the forces against her may be. The contrast between Snow White's purity and her stepmother's envy is stark and unsettling. Snow White's goodness is not just a surface-level trait. It runs deep into the core of her being. She is kind-hearted and loving, even in the face of rejection, and it is her unyielding innocence that allows her to survive the trials that come her way. Her purity is not something she consciously tries to preserve. It is simply who she is. In contrast, the Queen's vanity is a force of darkness, born of insecurity and the need for control. The Queen's jealousy is not just an emotion, it is a driving force that consumes her, leading her to manipulate, deceive, and destroy anyone who stands in her way. This dynamic between the innocent and the envious is what gives the tale its emotional depth. Snow White's purity is not just an idealized virtue. It is a reflection of a deeper, more powerful truth, that goodness can endure even in the face of overwhelming darkness. The Queen, on the other hand, is a tragic figure, a woman whose inability to accept the natural course of life and the changes it brings turns her into a bitter, vengeful creature. Her envy is a reflection of her inability to embrace the very thing that Snow White embodies, the impermanence of beauty and the inevitability of time. The Queen's ultimate fate, being punished by the very beauty she once sought to preserve, is a cruel irony. It is a fitting end for a character who allowed her vanity to consume her, but it is also a poignant reflection on the destructive nature of jealousy. Her death is not just a physical one. It is the death of her spirit, of the part of her that refused to grow, to change, and to accept the natural course of life. Snow White's story, in contrast, is one of rebirth. Her eventual awakening through the kiss of the prince symbolizes the triumph of purity over corruption. The moment she rises from her slumber is not just a magical return to life. It is a symbolic victory over the forces of vanity and malice. Snow White's innocence, though fragile, is unbreakable, and it is this purity that allows her to overcome the Queen's evil. It is as if the very essence of who she is, her goodness, her kindness, her beauty, acts as a shield against the darkness that sought to destroy her. In the end, little Snow White is not just a tale of good triumphing over evil. It is a story of love in its purest, most unconditional form. It is about a child who is loved not for her beauty, but for the goodness that lies within her, a goodness that cannot be tarnished, no matter how hard the world tries to do so. And while the Queen's jealousy and vanity lead to her demise, Snow White's purity and resilience ensure her victory. It is a stark reminder of the power of love, not just as a force that heals, but as a force that endures, that transforms, and that ultimately prevails over the darkest of emotions. Little Redcap, Innocence versus Deception in the Woods. The story of Little Redcap is a haunting exploration of innocence caught in the web of predatory evil, where trust and fear become intertwined, and the very nature of good and evil is tested in the heart of the forest. At its core, this tale is a psychological battle, one that unfolds between the girl's pure heart, full of trust, and the wolf's cunning deception, which seeks to exploit her innocence. The deep, almost primal tension in this story, the sharp contrast between the beauty of the woods and the malice lurking within, makes the journey of Little Redcap not just one of physical peril, but of emotional and moral discovery. From the very first step into the woods, Little Redcap is already ensnared by a quiet, looming danger. The woods, typically a place of wonder and adventure for children, are described with an almost suffocating sense of foreboding. The sunlight barely penetrates the thick canopy of trees. The path is narrow and winding, leading deeper into a shadowed world. This is no longer a place of innocence. It is a place where deception lurks behind every leaf, every rustling sound. The image of the wolf, a predator with a facade of politeness, stands in stark contrast to the little girl's naive belief in the goodness of the world. As Little Redcap skips along the path, carrying a basket for her sick grandmother, she is unaware of the deepening shadows around her. She has been warned by her mother to stay on the path, yet her childlike wonder and curiosity tug at her. The simple, idyllic nature of her mission, to visit her grandmother, is imbued with an innocent joy, a joy that blinds her to the looming threat of the wolf. She is trusting, sweet, and utterly unaware that her innocence makes her vulnerable to the greatest danger the woods have to offer. The wolf, sly and calculating, sees her not as a child, but as prey. When the wolf first speaks to Little Redcap, the tension begins to simmer. His words are smooth, inviting, and innocent. He asks her where she is going, and when she responds with an innocent trust, telling him of her journey to her grandmother's house, the wolf's plan is set into motion. It is here, at this very moment, that the internal battle between innocence and deception becomes apparent. Little Redcap's openness and lack of suspicion allow the wolf to exploit her vulnerability, his intentions hidden behind a mask of charm. He doesn't attack outright. Instead, he leads her astray with subtle suggestions. The beauty of the flowers she could pick, the songs of the birds she could listen to. Each step she takes further off the path, each flower she picks, is a step deeper into the wolf's trap. The wolf's deceit is a cruel reflection of the manipulation that often lurks behind predatory behavior. He lures her away from the safety of the path, sowing the seeds of her eventual peril. As Little Redcap moves deeper into the forest, away from the safety of her mother's warnings, she becomes unaware of how the world around her is changing. The path she has left behind becomes increasingly faint and lost to her, while the wolf, moving with calculated stealth, reaches her grandmother's house first. When Little Redcap finally arrives at her grandmother's house, the shift in atmosphere is palpable. The warm, welcoming cottage is no longer a haven of safety, but an ominous place where fear lies hidden behind a deceptive exterior. The wolf, now disguised in her grandmother's clothing, lies in wait, his malicious presence masked by a seemingly benign facade. The tension between trust and fear escalates as Little Redcap approaches the bed, her curiosity piqued by her grandmother's strange appearance. This moment, in its eerie stillness, highlights the battle between innocence and the chilling realization that something is terribly wrong. Little Redcap's innocent observations of her grandmother's big ears, big eyes, and big teeth are filled with an unsettling, childlike wonder. She doesn't immediately understand the danger. Instead, she asks questions, her words a reflection of both her innocence and the creeping dread that she is beginning to sense. The wolf's responses are cold, almost playful, as he taunts her with his monstrous form, all the better to eat you with. The innocence that Little Red Cap once carried so freely now begins to crack as she sees the wolf for what he truly is. The eventual triumph over evil is both harrowing and triumphant. As the wolf leaps from the bed, ready to pounce, the tension reaches its peak. Little Red Cap, who moments before was caught in a struggle between trust and fear, is now in the fight for her life. The hunter, a symbol of justice and protection, bursts into the room, shattering the wolf's dominance. With swift action, the hunter rescues Little Redcap and her grandmother, symbolizing the return of safety and the restoration of order. The wolf's fate is sealed in a brutal but just manner, a fitting end to a creature who thrived on deception and malice. Yet, this victory is not without emotional cost. Little Redcap's innocence has been shattered, but in its place, she gains a deeper understanding of the world around her. The woods, once a place of carefree exploration, now carry with them the weight of real danger. Little Redcap, in her triumph, has learned the harsh lesson that trust can be both a virtue and a vulnerability. The darkness that resides in the woods is not just a physical entity. It is the unseen force of evil that preys on the unsuspecting. Little Redcap stands as a timeless reflection on innocence lost and the power of deception. It is a story that not only entertains but provokes deep introspection on the nature of trust, fear, and the resilience required to overcome evil. Through vivid descriptions and a tension-filled narrative, the tale keeps us on edge, leaving a lingering sense of unease that heightens the story's emotional impact. This is a tale of survival, of courage in the face of darkness, and of the eventual triumph of good over evil, however hard-won it may be. The 12 Huntsmen. The tragic consequences of a broken promise. The tale of the 12 Huntsmen weaves a tragic narrative of love, duty, and the devastating consequences of a broken promise. At its heart, the story explores the deep emotional toll that unfulfilled vows have on both the heart and the soul. The prince's promise to his fiancée, made in a moment of love, is shattered by circumstance, and his eventual failure to recognize the weight of his words. What follows is a dark transformation, one that binds a woman's love to the cruel cost of duty and honor. This story unfolds with layers of internal conflict, emotional struggle, and ultimately, the prince's painful journey toward redemption. The prince, young and full of promise, is faced with the death of his father. The call of duty, the crown, and the burden of leadership weigh heavily upon him. In his haste to fulfill his royal responsibilities, the prince breaks the heart of his beloved fiancée. Promises made in moments of passion are swiftly cast aside as he must heed the demands of his kingdom, sacrificing his personal happiness for the greater good. But what is the cost of this sacrifice? What is the price of forsaking love for duty? As the prince leaves his fiancée behind, the foundation of their once strong bond begins to crumble. The emotional devastation of this moment is profound. The fiancée, betrayed by the man she loved, is forced into the shadows of grief. Her heart, once filled with hope and dreams of a life shared with her prince, is now shattered. She is left with no choice but to conceal her sorrow and disguise her pain. The transformation into a huntsman is not just physical, it is symbolic of her profound internal change. The girl, once a symbol of innocence and love, must now become a warrior, a shadow of the man who promised her the world and then abandoned it. Her identity is hidden, not just from the world, but from herself. She is forced to bury her emotions, suppress her love, and become something she never was, a figure defined by strength, by cold resolve, by duty. The prince, too, begins to suffer the consequences of his actions. Though he is blind to them at first, his new life as king consumes him, and the haunting presence of his lost love fades into the distance. Yet, as time passes, the prince feels the gnawing emptiness of his choice. His heart aches with a longing he cannot name, as though a piece of himself was ripped away in his haste. But it is not until he hears of a band of 12 huntsmen who serve under his command that the weight of his mistake becomes apparent. Their skill and unity intrigue him. But what he does not know is that these huntsmen are not simply skilled warriors. They are his fiancée and her loyal companions, who have transformed their identities in order to serve the prince. Dramatic tension builds with each passing moment. The prince, unaware of the identities of his huntsmen, begins to form an emotional bond with them, unknowingly entrusting his heart to the very people he betrayed. The huntsmen remain silent, hiding their true identities as they faithfully carry out their duties despite the deep emotional wounds they carry. Their devotion to their mission is not born of loyalty to the prince, but of a tragic duty to complete what was once a promise, one that was never fulfilled. As the narrative unfolds, the prince's heart begins to stir. His connection with the huntsman deepens, and he starts to notice the subtle, haunting echoes of the love he once shared. His growing admiration for these mysterious figures marks the beginning of his emotional journey toward redemption. It is only when he uncovers the truth, when he finally realizes the identity of his 12 huntsmen, that the full weight of his broken promise crashes upon him. The emotional revelation is overwhelming. In that moment, the prince is forced to face the consequences of his choices and the harm his decisions have wrought. The transformation of the fiancée and the emotional distance between the prince and his beloved becomes the catalyst for his self-awareness. The prince has always been consumed by his role, blind to the personal cost of his duty. But in learning the truth, he is forced to confront his own failure as a lover and a man. The realization stings deeply. His actions have not only cost him the love of his life, but have also betrayed the very essence of who he is as a man of honor and responsibility. This revelation sets the stage for his emotional journey toward redemption. No longer a man defined by his title or his duties, the prince must now navigate the difficult path back to the heart he once abandoned. In his efforts to mend the fractured bond with his fiancée, he faces an emotional trial, a journey back to her, not through titles or promises, but through sincere remorse and action. The prince's journey is one of deep humility, of learning that true love cannot be measured by the weight of a crown or the fulfillment of duty alone. Love, he learns, is not something that can be sacrificed for the sake of power. It is something to be nurtured, honored, and protected. In the end, the prince's realization and emotional journey bring him closer to his fiancée, but it is not without cost. His redemption is not immediate. It is earned through the painful recognition of his mistakes and the consequences of his actions. The 12 Huntsmen is a haunting tale of love lost and found again, of promises broken, and the price of redemption. The prince's emotional journey from betrayal to repentance echoes with the tragic beauty of the story, leaving the audience to ponder the true nature of love, sacrifice, and duty. Through the prince's emotional transformation, we are reminded that some promises, once broken, can only be mended through deep personal growth, and that true love can never be taken for granted. The Ungrateful Son, a story of greed and consequences. In the heart of a quiet village, nestled among towering trees and rolling hills, there lived a son whose actions would forever haunt him. A young man driven by selfish desires, a hunger not just for food, but for recognition, status, and comfort. His father, aging and frail, had worked tirelessly throughout his life, sacrificing his health and happiness to provide for his family. Yet, as time wore on, the father's once strong hands had become gnarled and shaking, and his eyes, which had once sparkled with life, were now clouded with the weight of years. And yet, despite the years of love and sacrifice, his son harbored a darkness within, a darkness that would lead him down a path of greed, selfishness, and irreversible consequences. The scene is set with a simple yet devastating act of betrayal. One evening, the father, weak and frail from the years of labor, returned home to the smell of a roast chicken wafting through the air, a delicious, comforting aroma that made his stomach growl in hunger. It was a rare treat, one his son had promised to share with him. But as the father entered the house, the son's face was filled with a quiet cruelty. The roast chicken, the promise of warmth and togetherness, was not meant for the father at all. The son had hidden it away, unwilling to share the meal with the man who had spent his life in toil for their family. What transpired in that moment was not merely an act of greed. It was a fundamental betrayal of love. The father, so used to giving, had asked for nothing in return except companionship and care in his old age. But the son's actions revealed a profound selfishness, one that mirrored his internal hunger for wealth, comfort, and status. With his mind clouded by desire, the son believed he could keep the roast chicken for himself, thinking that his father would not notice, thinking that his father would not be aware of the wound he had inflicted. The emotional weight of the father's realization is immeasurable. His trust, his love, and his sacrifices all laid bare before the coldness of his son's heart. This betrayal, small in the eyes of the world, but immense in its emotional depth, sent a ripple through the father's soul. In that moment, he felt the sting of years of selfless devotion, only to be repaid with an act of blatant disregard. As the father returned to his chair, his heart heavy with sorrow, the son began to eat the chicken, savoring each bite. Unbeknownst to him, this small act of selfishness would set off a chain of events that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a twist of fate, the chicken, the very symbol of his greed, transformed into something far more sinister. The son, thinking he had gotten away with his theft, soon found himself the victim of an otherworldly curse. His greed, though seemingly small and insignificant in that moment, would exact a heavy price. As he sat, content and oblivious, the roast chicken began to shift and change before his eyes. The smell, once inviting and comforting, began to sour. The meat seemed to grow heavier, the bones seemed to elongate, and the once beautiful roast now took on the grotesque form of a toad. Its large eyes gleaming with malevolent intent, the sun reached for the chicken, but it seemed to grow impossibly heavy. With each attempt to lift it, it only grew heavier, until, with a horrifying twist, the toad sprang to life and leapt onto his face, its cold, clammy skin pressing against his own. Fear surged through the son's body as the toad latched onto him, its presence both physical and symbolic. It was the manifestation of his greed, his selfishness, and his betrayal. No matter how hard he tried to remove it, it would not leave. The toad clung to him, its cold eyes filled with malevolent satisfaction. As he struggled, the toad seemed to multiply, a grotesque reminder of the darkness within him. What had begun as a simple act of selfishness, the theft of a roast chicken, now turned into a nightmare that no one could have anticipated. The son's cries were in vain, as the toad held tight, its grip unrelenting. It was a manifestation of the consequences of his actions, a physical representation of his greed that could not be ignored or erased. Each day the son was forced to live with the consequences of his ungratefulness. No matter how he tried to flee or how he begged for release, the toad remained. It was a curse he could never escape. As the days passed, the son's fate became more and more inescapable. His skin began to darken, his face grew pale and gaunt, and his eyes took on the same empty, soulless stare as the toad that clung to him. He had once been a man full of ambition and desire, but now he was consumed by the very thing he had sought to control. The toad had become a part of him, an eternal reminder of his mistakes. His life was now a twisted reflection of the selfishness that had led him down this dark path. The greed that had once seemed so small, so insignificant, had now spiraled into something far more horrifying. He had not just hidden the chicken from his father. He had betrayed the essence of love, of family, and of selflessness. And in the end, it was this betrayal that would consume him, locking him into an eternal struggle with the very creature he had created through his own actions. This emotionally charged tale of the ungrateful son is not just a story about a man's greed. It is a chilling reminder of the far-reaching consequences of selfishness, the gradual unraveling of the son's fate from a simple act of theft to an irreversible curse, serves as a powerful metaphor for the emotional cost of betrayal. The suspense builds with each passing moment as the son's life becomes increasingly dominated by the consequences of his actions. And in the end, there is no escape, not from the toad, nor from the unbearable truth that he has become the very thing he sought to avoid. A man consumed by greed, the Goose Girl, a tale of deception, beauty, and transformation. Once upon a time, in a kingdom swathed in golden light and the endless fields of green, there lived a princess, pure and unblemished in her beauty and kindness. She had always known her place in the world, surrounded by the love and warmth of her family. But in the depths of her soul, a deep, hidden fear lingered. one that no amount of royal affection could silence. The fear of losing everything, the fear of being cast aside, of her identity being stolen, swallowed whole by a force darker and more deceptive than anything she could imagine. The tale begins in a moment of cruel betrayal, when the princess is sent to marry a prince in a distant land, a union forged by her father's command. It was a journey that should have been one of joy, but it would soon transform into a twisted nightmare, a cruel twist of fate that would force her into the depths of despair. On the road to her new life, the princess's world began to crumble. Her maid, who had been entrusted to assist her, turned out to be a cunning, deceitful woman who sought nothing more than to steal the princess's place. With malice in her heart, the maid schemed to push the young princess into the shadows, to hide her true identity, and to take her place at the prince's side. With a subtle trick, she forced the princess into silence, casting her away like a worthless shadow in her own life. The princess was left with nothing, no name, no family, no purpose but to serve as a lowly goose girl, tending to the birds she had once commanded. The emotional pain of being cast out by her own father, of being replaced by a woman so filled with hatred and ambition, tore through the princess's soul. Her identity, her very self, had been stolen from her. She wandered in silence, the weight of this betrayal a constant ache in her heart. Every step she took, every moment she spent among the geese, was a reminder of her fall from grace. How could her father have allowed this? How could he, who had once held her so dearly, cast her out with such callousness? But in her darkest hour, the princess found something she had never known she possessed: strength. She was not just a victim of circumstance. She was not just a pawn in the cruel game of fate. No, the princess began to reclaim her identity, piece by fragile piece. She spoke to the geese, those simple creatures that had once been beneath her, and in their quiet company, she discovered something profound: her own voice. As the days stretched on, she grew in wisdom, learning the ways of the land, the ways of hardship, and the ways of the heart. The goose girl, once a victim of deception, began to rise from the ashes of her despair. She transformed, not in a grand, magical way, but in the quiet, steady progression of her own growth. With each passing day, she became more than the servant she had been forced to become. She became a woman, strong, determined, and unyielding in her pursuit of justice. The turning point came when the prince, unaware of the true identity of the girl who tended his geese, stumbled upon her one fateful day. He had heard of the beautiful, silent girl who worked among the birds, whose presence seemed to resonate with something beyond her appearance. There was something about her that caught his eye, something familiar in the way she carried herself, despite the hardships she faced. One day, as the prince walked near the field where the geese grazed, their paths crossed. The princess, at first, too shy to speak, finally lifted her eyes to meet his gaze. In that instant, the years of pain, of being hidden and silenced, seemed to lift from her shoulders. The connection was instantaneous, a recognition that neither of them could explain, but both felt deeply. The prince, entranced by her quiet strength and unspoken beauty, began to unravel the mystery of the goose girl. With each encounter he learned more about her, though he still did not know the truth. But fate had a way of twisting itself, and soon the princess's true identity was revealed, like a secret too long buried beneath the surface, ready to explode into the light of day. and when it did, it was a revelation that shook the kingdom to its core. The princess, once hidden away, was no longer the helpless victim of her circumstances. She had found her voice, her strength, her identity. No longer was she the meek girl who had been cast aside. She was a woman who had fought, who had endured, and who had triumphed. The reunion with her parents, with the king and queen who had once abandoned her, was not the fairy tale ending one might expect. It was bittersweet, heavy with the weight of all that had passed. The princess's heart had been scarred by the betrayal, by the years of silence and invisibility, but in the embrace of her parents, she found not just the love she had once known, but a deep sense of reclamation, a reclaiming of herself, of her identity, and of her worth. The transformation from victim to victor was not an easy one. It was marked by deep emotional wounds, by a silence that had consumed her for too long, and by the quiet strength that had carried her through. But in the end, the princess stood tall, not as a victim, not as a pawn, but as a woman who had overcome the darkness that sought to swallow her, and in that transformation, she became more than just a story. She became a symbol of resilience, of the power of reclaiming one's true self, no matter the cost. In her bittersweet reunion with her parents, she was not only reunited with her past, but also with her future. A future she would forge for herself. A future where her voice would no longer be silenced, and where she would no longer be defined by the deception of others. She had become, at last, the woman she was always meant to be. The old woman in the woods, the witch's curse, and the maiden's innocence, deep within the heart of an ancient, whispering forest, where sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of dark, twisted trees, there lived an old woman. To the unknowing, she appeared as nothing more than a harmless crone, her hands weathered and eyes dimmed by years of solitude. But beneath her frail exterior lay a heart steeped in envy and bitterness, a heart capable of magic so dark it could twist the very essence of a soul. She had once been young and beautiful, adored by all who crossed her path, until the arrival of a maiden whose purity and innocence cast a shadow over her once dominant beauty, the maiden whose gentle kindness spread like the fragrance of wildflowers in bloom, had unknowingly stirred the old woman's jealousy. She had always lived a sheltered life, untouched by the hardships that shaped others. But the moment she entered the witch's presence, a curse was set in motion, an irreversible bond forged between their fates, bound by the old woman's desire to reclaim the beauty that time had stolen from her. The witch, her heart racked with jealousy, concocted a spell dark and cruel that would strip the maiden of her beauty and innocence. She whispered the ancient words into the twilight air, the words carried by the wind through the trees and into the very core of the girl's being. As the maiden walked the path to her humble cottage, she could feel the change happening inside her, a subtle shift, like the turning of a page in a forgotten book. It was the first time she noticed the sharp chill in the air. Her heart began to beat erratically, her pulse quickening as an unseen force gripped her chest. When she looked into the reflection of the nearby pond, she barely recognized the face staring back at her. Her once radiant skin had faded, her eyes dulled to a stormy gray, and her hair, a cascade of golden locks, had become limp and lifeless. She trembled, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she touched her face, as though she could somehow restore the beauty that had been torn from her. The forest, which had once seemed like a welcoming sanctuary, now loomed around her like an unyielding prison. The trees whispered, the wind howled, and a sense of foreboding weighed heavily upon her. The maiden's innocence, which had once protected her from the world's darker truths, now felt like a shackle, keeping her bound to a fate she could neither understand nor escape. But the curse was not just one of physical transformation. No, it was deeper than that. It sought to break her spirit, to make her question her worth and her very identity. With each passing moment, she felt the grip of despair tighten around her like a vice. She wandered deeper into the woods, not knowing where she was going, but desperate to find something, anything, that might restore her. The more she searched, the more she realized that the world had changed around her, and she was no longer the girl she had once been. Every step she took seemed to echo her growing sense of loss. Then, amidst the trees, she saw something that sent a shiver down her spine. The old woman standing before her face twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. The witch's eyes gleamed with malicious delight, as if savoring the maiden's suffering. "You cannot escape what is already done," the witch crooned, her voice rasping like the rustle of dry leaves. "You were always too pure, too untouched by the realities of this world. Now, you will learn what it means to live in the shadows." The maiden's heart sank. The truth had finally dawned on her. The witch's magic was too strong, too rooted in the fabric of the forest itself. How could she, a mere girl, hope to break free from such ancient, twisted power? She felt the weight of her own helplessness pressing down on her chest, her once innocent soul now bruised by the bitterness of envy and the cruelty of the witch's curse. But even in the face of this overwhelming darkness, a flicker of defiance remained within her. It was the last spark of the innocence she had once possessed, untouched by the witch's poison. She had no choice but to fight back, to reclaim the purity that had been stolen from her. With trembling hands, she reached deep inside, searching for the strength she thought was gone. The wind seemed to answer her, swirling around her like a comforting embrace. A sudden clarity washed over her, and with it, the realization that she held more power than she had ever known. The curse had sought to strip her of her beauty, but it could not take her heart. It had tried to corrupt her innocence, but it could not diminish the goodness within her. She was not merely a victim of the witch's malice. She was a force in her own right, a force capable of transforming the curse into something stronger than any spell. The maiden's journey had not been one of power or magic, but one of resilience, of staying true to herself in the face of the darkest forces imaginable. The witch, sensing the shift in the maiden, lashed out, but the girl, now unafraid, stood her ground. "You can curse my form," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "You can try to destroy my innocence, but you cannot take my heart." With those words, the wind picked up once more, and the trees began to tremble. The ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with energy, as if the forest itself had recognized the maiden's transformation. The power of her inner light, her innocence and her resilience shattered the witch's hold over her. The curse that had been cast upon her began to unravel, the darkness lifting like fog before the morning sun. And in that moment, the maiden was no longer a victim of the witch's cruelty. She had reclaimed her true form, not in the physical sense, but in the most profound way possible. She had reclaimed herself. The witch, seeing the power of the maiden's heart and spirit, could only watch in despair as the girl walked away, leaving the forest behind. The curse had been broken, not by magic, but by the sheer force of innocence and strength. The maiden, now fully aware of her power, stepped into the world once more, her journey a testament to the transformative power of love, purity, and the courage to fight for one's true self. The forest, once dark and oppressive, now seemed to hum with a new life, as if the very air had been cleansed by the maiden's resilience. And though the witch's presence still lingered like a shadow, it was no longer enough to bring darkness to the girl's heart. She had emerged victorious, not through magic, but through the simple, unwavering strength of her own soul. The devil and the peasant. Cleverness overcomes evil. In a remote village nestled at the edge of a vast forest, there lived a peasant named Hans. He was not a man of great wealth, nor did he possess any remarkable talents. However, his sharp wit and cunning mind were renowned throughout the village. People often spoke of his cleverness, and many sought his advice when they found themselves in a bind. Yet Hans was not without his flaws. He was an opportunist at heart, always on the lookout for a chance to better his own situation. One day, as he toiled in his field, he noticed a figure approaching from the shadows. The man was tall and imposing, with eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. His clothes were fine, but there was something eerie about the way they fluttered, as if they were made of smoke rather than fabric. As he drew nearer, Hans felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was no ordinary traveler. This was the devil himself. The devil, sensing Hans's unease, smiled slyly and spoke in a voice that seemed to echo through the trees. "I've been watching you, Hans," he said. "You're clever, I've heard. You like to get by on your wit, don't you?" Hans, ever the pragmatist, quickly recovered from his shock. "I do what I must to survive," he replied, his voice steady despite the growing sense of dread in his chest. The devil leaned in closer, his grin widening. "I have a proposal for you," he said. "I will give you great wealth, power, and influence, beyond your wildest dreams. All I ask in return is your soul." Hans considered this carefully. The offer was tempting, but he wasn't so easily swayed. He had heard tales of men who made deals with the devil, only to regret it when the price came due. He knew that the devil's promises were often laced with tricks and loopholes. But Hans was no fool. He wasn't afraid of a challenge. With a glint in his eye, Hans replied, "A fair offer, devil, but I'm not one to give up my soul so easily. How about this? If you can outwit me in a game of riddles, I'll give you my soul. If I win, however, you'll give me your powers, and I'll be the one who walks away with all that you promised me." The devil's eyes flickered with amusement. "You dare to challenge me," he said with a laugh. "Very well, peasant, I accept your wager. But be warned, I am not a being who is easily outsmarted." And so, the game began. Hans, ever the trickster, knew that this was no simple contest. The devil was a being of immense intelligence and cunning, but Hans had something the devil did not, the element of surprise. He started with a riddle that seemed innocent enough, yet hid a deeper meaning. "I have a house with no doors and no windows," Hans said, his voice full of confidence. "Inside it, there is food, yet no one eats it. What am I?" The devil furrowed his brow, thinking hard. He could sense that there was a trick hidden within the riddle, but it eluded him. Hours passed as the devil pondered, but he could not find the answer. Finally, He admitted defeat. "Tell me, peasant," the devil said, his voice tinged with frustration. "What is the answer?" "The answer is an egg," Hans said with a grin. "It has no doors or windows, yet it contains food inside. And no one eats it, except for the one who cracks it open." The devil growled in annoyance, but he was not one to admit defeat easily. "You may have won this round, peasant, but the next riddle will be much harder," he warned. Hans's heart pounded in his chest, but he was determined to win. He knew that the devil's pride would not let him back out of the challenge, and he was counting on it. With a wicked smile, Hans posed his next riddle. "What has a heart that doesn't beat, a face that doesn't age, and a body that doesn't change?" The devil's confidence faltered as he considered the question. His mind raced, but once again, he was unable to find the answer. His eyes flickered with frustration, but he could not bring himself to admit defeat. "I will not lose to you, peasant," he snarled. "I demand that you tell me the answer." "A stone," Hans said triumphantly. "It has a heart that doesn't beat, a face that doesn't age, and a body that remains unchanged through the years." The devil's face twisted in fury, his pride wounded. "You think you can outwit me?" he hissed, his voice low and threatening. Hans, his heart racing with excitement, pressed his advantage. "I know I can. Now, devil, you must honor our agreement. Your powers are mine." The devil, his rage boiling over, hesitated. He could feel the weight of the peasant's words, the challenge he had so arrogantly accepted, now turning against him. The rules of the game had been set, and the devil's pride could not allow him to back out. With a roar of fury, he summoned his dark powers, but instead of claiming Hans's soul, he found his own powers slipping away, as the peasant's cunning had bound them to him. "You may have won this game, Hans," the devil said, his voice heavy with anger. "But know this, no victory comes without consequence." Hans, standing victorious but wary, felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He had done what no one had ever done before. He had outwitted the devil himself. The power that had been promised to him now lay within his grasp, but he knew that it came at a cost. The devil may have been tricked, but there was no telling what dark consequences might unfold in the future. And so, as the devil vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of sulfur and smoke, Hans stood alone in the field, his mind racing with the possibilities of what he could achieve with the power now within his reach. But as the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that the devil's words might be more true than he wished. In the end, Cleverness had won the day. But at what cost? Only time would tell. The shepherd boy and his royal wisdom, an unexpected answer. In a quiet corner of the kingdom, there lived a shepherd boy named Thomas. His life was simple, his days spent tending to his flock, watching the clouds drift by, and listening to the wind whisper through the tall grass. He had no wealth, no title, and no power. Yet there was something in him, something beyond his humble beginnings, that made him stand out, a rare, almost otherworldly wisdom that was born not from books, but from the quiet observation of life around him. Thomas was content with his life in the meadows, but his peaceful existence was about to be shaken by a royal summons. The king, a man known for his sharp mind and iron will, had heard of the boy's uncanny ability to answer questions no one else could, and so, in the quiet of the night, Thomas was called to the palace, where his fate would take a turn he could never have imagined. The journey to the royal palace was long and daunting. Thomas, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a few coins in his pocket, found himself stepping into a world far beyond the simple hills and valleys he had known. The towering walls of the palace loomed over him, and the courtiers, dressed in fine silks and jewels, eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They whispered to each other, wondering what business a humble shepherd had in the presence of their great king. But Thomas, though nervous, stood tall. He knew that his wisdom was his greatest asset, and now it was time to prove that it was more valuable than gold or power. When he entered the royal court, the king, seated on his grand throne, eyed him with a piercing gaze. The air was thick with tension, and Thomas felt a weight settle on his shoulders. The challenge that awaited him was not one of physical prowess, but one of intellect. The king had devised 3 questions, each more difficult than the last. The answer to them, he said, would determine whether Thomas would leave the palace a man of fortune or a man condemned to the dungeons. There was no middle ground. The first question came swiftly, the king's voice cold and commanding. How many drops of water are there in the ocean? Thomas felt the weight of the question, its impossible nature pressing down on him. He could see the sneers of the courtiers, who surely believed he would fail. But Thomas, ever the thinker, closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of the court, the murmur of the crowd, the distant rustle of the tapestries. Then, with a calm voice, he spoke. "Your Majesty," he began, "if you wish to know how many drops of water there are in the ocean, then you must first answer this. How many grains of sand are there on every beach? Or how many stars are in the sky? The ocean, like the sky and the earth, is infinite. The number you seek is beyond our comprehension, for it is ever-changing. And yet, just as the ocean embraces the shores, we must embrace the mystery of that which we cannot count." Stunned silence filled the room. Thomas's answer, while not the concrete answer the king had hoped for, was the truth. The king, taken aback, gave no sign of approval, but Thomas could see the flicker of respect in his eyes. The second question came swiftly. How many stars are there in the sky? This time, Thomas did not hesitate. He stood before the king, his posture unwavering. "My lord, you ask how many stars there are in the sky, yet the sky is not a finite thing. It stretches beyond what we can see, beyond the limits of our minds. The stars are not meant to be counted. They are meant to remind us of the infinite possibilities that lie before us, of the vastness of the world we live in, and the mysteries that await us." The courtiers exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. The king, however, was visibly moved. "And what would you have me do with this answer?" he asked, his voice softer now. Thomas's response was simple, yet profound. "Live with the understanding that the world is vast and beyond our full understanding. Do not seek to measure what cannot be measured." The king nodded slowly, a shadow of a smile creeping onto his lips. Finally, the king asked the last and most daunting question. How many seconds of time are there in eternity? This question, more than the others, carried a weight of desperation in it. The king's voice, usually so firm, quivered with the uncertainty of his own soul. Thomas knew that this was not a challenge born of intellectual curiosity, but of something deeper, something that reflected the king's fear of his own mortality. Thomas thought for a moment, then answered, his voice steady, yet filled with an unspoken sadness. Eternity is not a measure of time, my king. It is the space between moments, the feeling of a lifetime lived in a single heartbeat. It cannot be counted, because it is not meant to be understood. The only true eternity is the love we give and the lives we touch. Time, in its infinite nature, is not bound to the seconds on a clock. It is what we make of each fleeting moment. The room was silent, the weight of Thomas's words hanging in the air. The king sat back, his face pale, as if the young shepherd had spoken directly to his soul. For a moment, Thomas saw not the ruler of a kingdom, but a man lost in the uncertainty of his own existence, searching for meaning in a world he could never fully control. The king, unable to hide his emotions any longer, spoke softly. You have answered wisely, Thomas, perhaps wiser than any man I have known. And so, with his heart heavy, yet his mind clear, Thomas returned home to the simple life he had always known. He did not leave the palace with riches or power, but with something far greater. The understanding that wisdom is not about answers, but about the questions we dare to ask. His fate, once sealed in the hands of royalty, was now his own to shape. The shepherd boy had not only outwitted a king, but had also found the courage to change his destiny, proving that the greatest wisdom comes not from the throne, but from the heart. The 12 Apostles, a timeless legend of faith and sacrifice in the heart of an ancient forest nestled deep within the sacred hills. 12 brothers once lived. Their names were known to no one but the stars themselves. They were men of simple origins, born not to power or wealth, but to a quiet and unwavering faith that bound them together. They were not merely siblings by blood, they were brothers in spirit, united by a common purpose that transcended the mortal world. Their story began long before the passage of time would alter their fates. A prophecy had been whispered to their mother, a humble woman of unshakable faith, who prayed each night for the world to see the coming of the Savior. Her prayers were not for herself, nor for the riches of this earth, but for the salvation of all humanity. She believed with every fiber of her being that her sons would be the ones to witness the birth of the Savior and usher in an era of divine light. Her belief was as steadfast as the mountains themselves, but as the years passed, the world seemed to turn ever darker. The brothers, guided by their mother's unwavering faith, set out on a pilgrimage, traveling through wild, untouched lands. Each day, their hearts grew more resolute in their faith, yet the world around them seemed more distant from the divine promise. And then, one fateful night, under the ethereal glow of the moon, the heavens whispered a command. The brothers were chosen, not just for their devotion, but for the sacred role they would play in the cosmic dance of time. They would be called to slumber, not for a few nights but for centuries, as the world continued its tumultuous march toward salvation. They would sleep beneath the earth, their eyes closed to the suffering and struggle of humanity, until the moment arrived when they were needed most. They would wait in silent repose, unseen and forgotten, for the Savior to come. The brothers, bound by their unbreakable faith, agreed to this divine calling. Their sacrifice was a heavy one, to give up their lives, their youth, their very existence, to the promise of a greater purpose. It was a promise that transcended the world they knew, a promise that their eyes would one day open to witness the culmination of all their waiting, the arrival of the Savior. Their mother, with tears in her eyes and a prayer on her lips, placed each of her sons into the sacred cradles beneath the hills, and so they slept, sleeping not from weariness, but from the divine grace that carried them into an eternal rest, a rest that would span the ages. As the centuries passed, the world changed around them, its history unfolding in the most harrowing of ways. Wars raged, kingdoms rose and fell, and humanity continued its struggle for meaning. But the 12 brothers, untouched by time, remained in their slumber, the dust of ages gently settling over them. The world, unaware of their sacrifice, marched on without knowing that 12 souls, so pure and devoted, waited in the shadows. Their faith, unbroken by the passing of centuries, was a quiet hymn that echoed through the corridors of time, untouched by doubt or despair, for they knew that their awakening was not of their own choosing, but of a divine plan that reached beyond the mortal coil. Then, one day, when the world had reached its darkest hour, when humanity had lost its way and the weight of sin threatened to suffocate the earth, the moment came. The stars aligned, the heavens trembled, and the divine light that had long been promised to the world shone down. The Savior was born, and with his arrival, the world was forever changed. It was then that the brothers stirred. The first to awaken was Peter, whose heart was filled with a warmth that had not existed in his long, peaceful slumber. His eyes fluttered open, and the world around him seemed so vast, so different from the one he had left behind. He blinked, his senses overwhelmed, and he found himself standing alongside his 11 brothers. They too had awakened, their spirits renewed, and their purpose fulfilled. The moment was profound. An overwhelming flood of emotions surged through them. The faith they had held for so long, the endless waiting, the sacrifice of their earthly lives, it all came rushing back. And in that moment, they understood. They were the chosen, the 12 apostles, and they had been called forth at the precise moment in time when their mission was most needed. They looked at each other, a bond deeper than blood uniting them in a way words could not express. Their hearts swelled with a sense of divine purpose that transcended all that had come before. They were not merely witnesses to the Savior's arrival, but bearers of his message, his love, and his salvation. The weight of their sacrifice was not a burden. It was a gift that had carried them through the centuries, now revealed in the form of the Savior's light. As they stepped into the world once more, they were not the same men who had fallen into slumber. The world was different, and so were they. The brothers, now apostles, were transformed by the divine love they had waited so long to witness. They had given everything, time, youth, and even their very identity, for a cause greater than themselves, and in the light of the Savior, their faith had been made manifest. The emotional relief that surged through them was overwhelming. Their waiting had not been in vain. The Savior was here, and the world, for all its struggles and darkness, was given a second chance. The brothers were not just witnesses to this moment. They were part of it, and they would go forth, spreading the message of hope, love, and redemption, to a world that so desperately needed it. The 12 apostles, their faces now aglow with the divine light they had awaited for so long, knew their journey had only just begun. Their awakening was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something far greater, a journey of faith, sacrifice, and salvation that would echo through the ages. The world had changed, and so had they, but the core of their purpose remained steadfast, to carry the message of the Savior to the ends of the earth. And with each step they took, they knew they were fulfilling the divine plan that had been set into motion long ago. The gifts of the little folk, greed versus generosity. In a world where appearances deceive and the simplest of gestures can alter fate, the story of the tailor and the goldsmith unfolds. A tale as old as time itself, but one that remains ever relevant. It is a story of two men whose choices would not only define their destinies, but echo the age-old battle between greed and generosity. Their journey begins not with grandiose ambitions, but with a single, unremarkable evening, a night that would shift the course of their lives forever. The tailor and the goldsmith, two wanderers, had spent many long days traversing the land, their feet worn and their bodies weary from the burdens of travel. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting an amber glow across the mountains. As they trudged through the thickening forest, they had heard the distant sound of music, a melody so enchanting that it seemed to call to them from beyond the veil of the world they knew. Intrigued and driven by a mixture of curiosity and hunger, they quickened their pace, drawn toward the source. As they crested a hill, they saw it, a small, lively gathering of little folk, dancing and singing around a fire. The scene was almost otherworldly, like something pulled from the pages of a forgotten myth. The air was thick with the sweetness of their songs, and the fire crackled with an energy that felt ancient, timeless. At the center of the circle sat an old man, his weathered face adorned with a long, gray beard that flowed like a river down his chest. His eyes gleamed with a knowing warmth, and he beckoned the two strangers forward with a simple wave of his hand. The goldsmith, always one to covet wealth and treasure, was immediately struck by the sight of the little folks' abundance, their golden trinkets, their shimmering jewels, their laughter. There was something about the wealth they possessed that seemed far more alluring than any riches he had seen before. The tailor, on the other hand, was more cautious, hesitant to embrace such wonder without knowing its true cost. But the goldsmith, in his greed, pressed on, eager to partake in whatever fortune lay ahead. The old man, with a knowing smile, invited them to join the circle. With a gleam in his eye, he promised them both a gift in exchange for their company. The tailor, though wary, agreed, and soon found himself drawn into the dance, his earlier reservations forgotten as the rhythm of the music filled his soul. The goldsmith, however, saw only the gold and glitter that surrounded him. He could barely contain his excitement as the old man handed him a small, ornate bundle. "Take this," the old man said, his voice like a whisper. "It is a gift for you, but beware. This gift is not for the greedy at heart." The goldsmith, eager to seize his reward, barely listened to the warning. He quickly stashed the bundle away, his mind already turning to thoughts of how he could trade or sell whatever treasure it contained. In the glow of the firelight, he failed to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The tailor, meanwhile, was gifted with a simple token, a small but elegant pouch, filled with what seemed like ordinary coal. He too felt the pull of temptation, but his heart was lighter, his desires less consumed by material wealth. As the dance continued, he felt a warmth spread through him, an understanding that the gift was more than it seemed. The old man's gaze, steady and wise, held a certain truth, one that the tailor, though unaware, was beginning to grasp. The next morning, as dawn broke and the music faded into silence, the two men made their way back down the path. The goldsmith, his hands trembling with anticipation, eagerly opened his bundle to reveal what he hoped would be a fortune. But to his shock, all he found was a handful of coal, dark, ordinary, and useless. In the eyes of someone so blinded by greed, his heart sank, and a bitter anger rose within him. How could he have been deceived? He had worked for this. He deserved more than this paltry gift. His frustration only deepened as he examined the coal, the blackened pieces now taunting him with their very ordinariness. In contrast, the tailor opened his pouch with a quiet curiosity. What he found, however, was nothing less than a treasure, a pile of gold that shimmered as if it had been plucked straight from the sun. The tailor's eyes widened in disbelief, but rather than feeling elation, he felt something else, a profound sense of peace. He had not expected such a reward, but now that he held it, he understood. This gift had come not because of his desire, but because of his generosity, his willingness to give of himself freely. The goldsmith, too consumed by his greed to understand the lesson before him, grew bitter with each passing day. The coal in his possession seemed to mock him, its worth as worthless as his own soul. His life, once filled with ambition and desire, was now overshadowed by regret. He had been blinded by his hunger for riches, and now he saw that the true cost of his greed was far greater than he could have ever imagined. As time passed, the goldsmith found himself growing more isolated, his wealth seeming only to deepen his unhappiness. The tailor, on the other hand, shared his fortune with those around him, spreading kindness and generosity wherever he went. His life, though simple, was rich in ways the goldsmith could never understand. Finally, the day came when the goldsmith, his heart weighed down by the consequences of his actions, sought out the old man again. He approached with a humility he had never known, hoping for a chance to make amends. The old man, whose eyes held the wisdom of the ages, gazed at him kindly. He knew the goldsmith's heart, the conflict that raged within him, and the quiet suffering he had caused himself. "Do you see now?" the old man asked, his voice gentle. "Greed, once awakened, will consume you, but generosity, freely given, will never lead you astray." In that moment, the goldsmith understood. His eyes fell to the ground, his heart heavy with the weight of his choices. He had been given a chance to change, to redeem himself, but it was not the gold that would save him. It was the generosity he had long ignored, the compassion that had eluded him. With a final sorrowful glance at the tailor, who had found peace in his own way, the goldsmith made a choice. He would no longer seek wealth at the expense of others. He would learn to give, to share, and in doing so, he would find a wealth far greater than any gold could offer, a wealth of the heart, a treasure beyond measure. And so, the tale of the tailor and the goldsmith came to its end, with the goldsmith's heart finally at peace. It was not the coal nor the gold that had determined their fates. It was the choices they made, the emotions they embraced, and the generosity that transformed their lives forever. The goldsmith's story, though marked by greed, had led him to redemption through the quiet realization that true wealth lies not in what we hold, but in what we give. The Goose Girl at the Well, a transformation of the heart in a world where destiny twists like a shadow on the wall. The story of the Goose Girl is one of profound transformation, both of identity and of heart. Her tale begins not in the grandeur of a palace, but in the humble solitude of a cottage, where she lived as a servant, dreaming of a life far grander than her daily toil. Yet even the simplest of lives can hold moments of quiet magic, hidden beneath the surface of routine, where destiny stirs in the most unexpected ways. She was a girl of beauty and grace, her hair as golden as sunlight, her eyes the color of the sky after a summer storm. But despite her outward beauty, her life was one of hardship. She worked tirelessly, a servant to a life she had no control over, bound by the heavy chains of her circumstances. Each day she tended to the geese with a quiet melancholy, the endless clucking of the birds the only song she knew. Her heart longed for something more, something beyond the fields, beyond the simple chores, beyond the confines of her position. Yet she was forced to accept the role that life had given her. But fate, it seemed, had more in store for her than she could ever have imagined. When the time came for her to journey to the royal palace as part of her service to the queen, she took it upon herself with quiet resignation, never suspecting that this would be the beginning of her transformation. As she traveled, the weight of her journey seemed heavier with each passing step, the miles stretching before her like an endless desert of dust and longing. Her only companion was the goose, their soft, steady pace, a reminder of the loneliness that had always defined her existence. The journey, as difficult as it was not without its trials. Along the way, she was confronted with the wickedness of her own heart, a bitter realization that would forever alter her path, for in the silence of her mind she harbored a secret desire, a longing for something more, something grander than the life she had known. The realization of her own ambition shocked her, for she had never allowed herself to feel such things before. Her identity had been tied to her service, to her duty, and now, in the depths of her heart, she could feel a stirring, a shift in the very core of her being. When she arrived at the palace, it was as if the world had opened up before her, revealing a new and terrifying truth. She was not meant to be a servant. The beauty of the castle, the grandeur of the surroundings, stirred something deep inside her, something she could no longer ignore. She walked through the royal halls, her eyes wide with wonder. But there was a shadow that followed her, a whisper at the back of her mind, telling her that she was more than just a lowly goose girl. The palace seemed to recognize her as well, as if it too had been waiting for her return. In a twist of fate, however, her moment of transformation would not come easily. The queen, who had once been kind to her, now turned cold, her eyes full of suspicion. The girl's beauty and elegance had been mistaken for arrogance, her gentle manners seen as a weakness in the eyes of the cruel and jealous queen. But as the goose girl faced the scorn and isolation of the palace, she was forced to confront the truth of her own heart, the truth that she was not the servant she had always believed herself to be, but someone far greater, someone deserving of more than this life of subjugation. It was in the depths of her loneliness that her true transformation began. The palace, once a place of wonder, now felt like a prison. The girl had always thought that she had been content, in her humble role, but in the cruel light of the queen's disdain, she realized that she had been holding herself back. She had believed that being a servant was her fate, that she was nothing more than the sum of her duties. But in the depths of the palace's cold walls, she began to see the reflection of something else. A girl who was more than just the sum of her parts, someone destined for more. Her choices became more deliberate as she navigated the treacherous world of court life. With every interaction, every glance, every word spoken, she fought to reclaim the power that had been taken from her. The Goose Girl, now a woman with a purpose, understood the cost of her silence. She had kept herself hidden for so long, locked away in the role that had been forced upon her, that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand tall, to speak her truth. It was in these quiet moments of realization that the true magic of her transformation occurred. As she looked into the mirror of the palace, the girl saw not just her reflection, but the person she had always been, a woman capable of love, of strength, and of courage. The quiet servant, the meek Goose Girl, was no more. She had shed the cloak of humility and stepped into the light of her own true self, a self worthy of respect, of admiration, and most importantly, of love. The girl's journey was one of painful self-discovery, as she realized that her true identity had always been inside her. She was not simply a servant, bound by fate and circumstance, but a woman with the power to shape her own destiny. The palace that had once seemed so foreign to her now felt like home, a place where she could finally breathe, where her true self could emerge. In the final moments of her transformation, the girl found herself standing before the queen, no longer afraid of what she might say, no longer bound by her past. It was then that she understood the power of her own identity, the strength she had hidden for so long. The Goose Girl, now a princess, had reclaimed her rightful place in the world. Her journey was not just one of physical transformation, but of emotional growth, a reminder that we are all capable of becoming the person we were always meant to be, if only we have the courage to shed the roles that bind us and embrace the truth within. Her reunion with her parents, when it came, was bittersweet. It was not just the joy of being restored to her rightful place in the palace that filled her heart, but the realization that she had found herself in the process. The girl had transformed, not just on the outside, but within, and in that moment, she knew she had finally become the person she had always been destined to be. Conclusion: the enduring power of Grimm's tales. The Brothers Grimm's tales have survived centuries, casting their long, haunting shadow across the generations, forever intertwined with the dark recesses of our collective consciousness. These stories, dark, tragic, and at times unsettling, continue to grip the hearts of all who encounter them. Their impact is profound, reaching far beyond the pages of dusty books, embedding themselves in the very fabric of human storytelling. What is it about these grim narratives, fraught with suffering, death, and rebirth, that continues to resonate with us today? In these stories, we find more than just fantastical creatures and magical events. We find the rawest elements of human nature, the pain of loss, the struggle against evil, the triumph of goodness against insurmountable odds. These universal themes are deeply embedded in the human experience, whether it is the jealousy of Snow White's stepmother, the unrelenting suffering of the Goose Girl, or the enduring faith of the 12 apostles. Each story speaks to the most fundamental emotions we experience as people. These tales encapsulate the joy of transformation, the agony of betrayal, the sweetness of redemption, and the weight of sacrifice. But perhaps the most striking element of the Grimm's tales is their paradox. The stories are suffused with an eerie, almost sinister energy, yet they are also brimming with a deep emotional richness. They are often stories of innocence caught in the grip of an evil beyond comprehension, yet they are also stories of resilience, of the human spirit rising again, stronger than before. This tension between light and dark, good and evil, cruelty and redemption, creates a complex emotional landscape that both disturbs and comforts us. These themes, though rooted in folklore, are timeless. They continue to speak to the fears, hopes, and desires we hold deep within us. In today's world, the influence of these tales is undeniable. Contemporary storytelling, whether in literature, film, or television, draws heavily from the archetypes and narratives found within the Grimm's stories. Characters who are both heroic and flawed, tales that explore the duality of human nature, and plots driven by deep moral dilemmas all owe their existence to the Grimm brothers' legacy. Modern fairy tales, while often sanitized for younger audiences, still carry the echoes of their darker, original forms, even as we enjoy these retellings. Whether in Disney adaptations or modern reinterpretations, there is an unmistakable pullback to the haunting versions of these stories that linger at the core of the collective imagination. What makes these tales so enduring in a world that seems to become increasingly complex and chaotic? It is because they tap into something more primal, more enduring than just entertainment. The Grimm brothers were, above all, storytellers who understood the power of myth. They understood that stories, at their heart, serve as both a reflection and a guide. They give us insight into the darkest corners of the human soul, but they also offer hope, showing us that even in the deepest despair, there is room for redemption. It is this blend of darkness and light, of sorrow and joy, that makes their stories so emotionally potent and universally relevant. Grimm's tales challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths. They ask us to face the terrors that dwell within us all, the cruelty we are capable of, the fragile nature of innocence, and the difficulty of change. Yet, they also remind us of the possibility for transformation, of the promise that from the darkness we can rise stronger and more whole than before. The resilience found in these stories, whether it's the mother's sacrifice in the Juniper Tree, the perseverance of Snow White, or the ultimate triumph of good in Little Red Cap, is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Today, we find ourselves revisiting these ancient tales, not just for entertainment, but for the deep emotional lessons they impart. In a world that can often feel as dark as the forests of Grimm's imagination, we are reminded by these stories that we are not alone in our struggles. The heroes and heroines of the Grimm's stories, while often facing insurmountable odds, find their way through with courage, faith, and love. Their journeys speak to the eternal struggle between light and dark, and they remind us that no matter how grim the world may seem, there is always a glimmer of hope, a possibility for redemption, and the promise of new beginnings. The Brothers Grimm's tales have a magnetic quality that draws us in, even as they terrify us. Their emotional depth, ranging from love and betrayal to sacrifice and redemption, ensures that these stories will endure, echoing through the ages. In a world constantly changing, these dark yet emotionally rich tales continue to resonate because they speak to something universal within all of us. They are stories of survival, of triumph, and ultimately of transformation, a transformation that mirrors our own, reminding us that we are capable of both the greatest darkness and the greatest light, as long as the human heart continues to feel, as long as we continue to search for meaning in the chaos of life. The tales of the Brothers Grimm will remain relevant, powerful, and deeply moving. Their legacy is not just in the words they wrote, but in the emotional truths they uncovered, the raw, haunting beauty of the human experience, a beauty that continues to captivate and inspire us today. So, as we close the book on these ancient stories, we carry their lessons within us, knowing that no matter where we go, the shadows of the Grimm brothers' world will always be there, whispering, waiting, and reminding us of the delicate balance between darkness and light